Imagine you're a caveman. You're cold, hungry, and someone just stole your favorite rock. What do? Well, you could club him and start a blood feud that lasts 6 generations, or you could invent government. Yes, government. Our species' awkward attempt to stop eating each other and start organizing. The story of strong central governments begins not with a constitution, but with a fire pit, a pointy stick, and someone yelling, "I'm in charge now because I said so." In prehistoric times, leadership was simple. The guy with the best hunting skills or the most grandpa energy got to call the shots. Rules were unwritten, justice was personal, and power came from respect, fear, or how many mammoths you'd successfully poked with a stick. These early groups were small, bands and tribes, and didn't really need a central government. Decisions were made communally or by whoever shouted the loudest and had the most scars. But as human groups grew, so did our problems. More people meant more disagreements. Who gets the good cave? Who owns the fishing spot? Whose goat keeps eating everyone else's shoes? Eventually, someone needed to settle disputes, organize food supplies, and make sure nobody hoarded all the obsidian. Enter the first big leap, civilization. Nowhere was this leap toward central government more impressive or more committed to spreadsheets than stone tablets than in ancient Egypt. Egypt didn't just have a strong central government, it practically invented the genre. While other early civilizations were experimenting with kings who occasionally yelled at people and collected grain, Egypt created an entire apparatus of governance that would make modern bureaucrats weep with pride. At the heart of it all was the pharaoh, not just a king, but a living god. His authority was absolute. He was the spiritual, military, judicial, agricultural, architectural, and celestial head of the country. If Egypt were a corporation, the pharaoh was the CEO, the HR department, the legal team, and the brand mascot. But here's the thing, it worked. Egypt was incredibly stable for much of its 3,000-year history, and it wasn't because everyone was chill and vibing in linen skirts. It was because the government was deeply organized, ruthlessly efficient when it worked, and built on a level of centralization that was centuries ahead of its time. The Nile's annual flooding was life or death. Predict it right, organize labor to dig canals, store excess grain for bad years, and boom, prosperity. Miss the window, and suddenly it's famine, rebellion, and a few pharaohs mysteriously falling down staircases. So they built a government capable of tracking the seasons, managing massive agricultural infrastructure, deploying tax collectors, maintaining roads, organizing a military, and overseeing long-term building projects that spanned decades. And this wasn't just strong government, it was standardized government. Egypt had a system of provincial governors called nomarchs, who reported to the central authorities. They built state granaries, temple complexes, schools for scribes, and a system of civil service that laid the blueprint for future empires. If Rome was the master of law and China the master of civil exams, Egypt was the original architect of big government does big things. In fact, Egypt's concept of central governance influenced later empires directly and indirectly. The Greeks admired and studied Egyptian knowledge and political structure. The Romans practically swooned over Egypt's ability to administer massive public works. Even early Islamic caliphates built upon Egypt's existing bureaucratic foundations when they inherited the region centuries later. What made Egypt truly special was that its central government wasn't just about controlling people. It was about creating a unified national identity. Egypt was one of the first places where the idea of a nation-state, though not in modern terms, took form. The same gods, the same architecture, the same rituals, the same sense of belonging to a centralized culture, that was powerful, and the government made it possible. Egypt made it clear that with a strong enough central authority, you could transcend tribal divisions, build massive infrastructure, create lasting cultural institutions, and keep people fed and mostly not revolting for centuries. It was the first real proof of concept that large-scale civilization could function long-term if it was tightly organized and deeply centralized. So when we talk about the origins of government, Egypt isn't just another ancient state. It's the blueprint, the first great experiment that showed the world, hey, maybe letting one guy with a fancy hat and a massive bureaucracy run things isn't such a bad idea after all. Until it is, but that's later. Meanwhile, over in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, they weren't building pyramids, they were building laws. Here we get Hammurabi's Code, one of the first written legal systems. It wasn't divine rule, but something arguably more terrifying, bureaucracy with consequences. The Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians developed city-states and kingdoms with complex administrations, trade systems, and armies. They created writing mostly to count grain and sheep. But hey, that's the backbone of civilization. Centralized power allowed cities to flourish, fight, and get conquered repeatedly, like an ancient version of musical chairs. In China, central government was practically a national hobby. Dynasties rose and fell, but the idea of a single emperor ruling over vast territories stuck like rice on a wok. The Qin dynasty was the first to unify China under one ruler with standardized currency, measurements, and even axle widths for carts. The Han dynasty gave us civil service exams, because what's more central government-y than making people study Confucian essays for 30 years before they're allowed to file paperwork? Confucianism emphasized hierarchy, order, and loyalty to authority, ideals that made centralized government not just accepted, but morally righteous. The emperor wasn't divine like in Egypt, but he did have the mandate of heaven, which is like saying, God wants me in charge unless I mess up, in which case, never mind. In Greece, governance went in a different direction. The city-states like Athens experimented with democracy, but don't get too excited. It was a democracy where only free male citizens could vote, which means about 90% of the population still just watched from the sidelines. Still, the idea of rule by the people, not just by gods or kings, was revolutionary. Then came Rome. Rome was government on steroids. They created the Republic, then threw it away for empire. The Romans invented legal frameworks, road networks, and ways to tax people so thoroughly it still gives modern accountants a rush. Strong central government allowed Rome to expand across continents. But when that same government became bloated, corrupt, and basically forgot how to run things, the empire split and crumbled. And that brings us to the ultimate whoops of history, the fall of Rome and the beginning of the European Dark Ages. When Rome collapsed, it left a power vacuum the size of Texas. There was no strong central authority to protect trade routes, enforce laws, or even tell people what year it was. Europe devolved into a patchwork of feudal lords, warring kingdoms, and really bad dental hygiene. Without strong central governments, justice became a personal affair. Lords handled local disputes, knights enforced power with swords, and peasants just tried not to die. Information moved at the speed of gossip, and coordination across regions was laughable. It was government in the loosest sense. Basically, whoever owns the biggest castle makes the rules. But slowly, order returned. Strong monarchies re-emerged. Kings centralized power again, often backed by religion or divine right. The printing press helped consolidate state messages. National identities formed. But with centralization came tension. People started asking questions, like, why does the king get to tax me for a war I didn't start? Why can't I vote? Why is Marie Antoinette eating cake while I'm eating mud? So began the revolutions. America told Britain, no taxation without representation. France chopped off a few heads and shouted, liberté, while trying to invent modern bureaucracy. Russia threw out the czars, then installed a government so centralized it made the old czars look chill by comparison. The West began to drift toward smaller government ideals. Enlightenment thinkers argued for limits on power, checks and balances, constitutions. The United States became the poster child for limited government, even if it got a little imperial here and there. Meanwhile, in the East, strong governments remained more respected. In China, centuries of Confucian values and historical cycles of chaos made centralized control seem not only desirable but necessary. A strong state ensured stability, development, and national unity. In Russia, constant invasions, harsh geography, and historical autocracy created a culture that valued strength and central leadership. A weak government meant collapse. A strong one meant survival. So what's the scorecard? Strong governments give us roads, hospitals, education, national defense, and coordination in times of crisis. But they also bring bureaucracy, overreach, corruption, and sometimes terrifying surveillance. Small governments promote freedom, individual rights, and personal responsibility. But they can also lead to inequality, disorganization, and dangerous power vacuums, like what we've seen in countries like Afghanistan or Libya, where weak or absent governments open the door for chaos, insurgencies, or warlords with too many pickup trucks. Interestingly, the private sector has picked up a few tricks from central governments. Corporations now have HR departments that act like ministries, CEOs who behave like heads of state, and mission statements that read like national constitutions. Amazon might not collect taxes, but they sure do have policies, security, and enough data on you to start a small country. But it's not just mimicry. Sometimes corporations and wealthy individuals outright influence or act as governments. In many countries, large companies wield enormous political power, lobbying for policies that suit their interests. In the U.S., members of Congress are overwhelmingly wealthy, with some sitting representatives worth tens of millions. That raises questions about whose interests they really represent. In developing nations, it's not uncommon for leaders to treat the state like a business empire. Corruption becomes institutionalized, national resources are sold off or hoarded, and governing becomes more about profit than policy. In effect, these leaders become CEOs of their countries, with shareholders being their cronies, not their citizens. This blurring line between political power and economic influence challenges our very idea of government. Who's really in charge, the elected officials or the billionaires with private jets and political PACs? So where are we now? Today's governments are walking a tightrope. Citizens want freedom but expect services. We hate taxes but love paved roads. We distrust politicians but scream at them to fix everything. We want smaller governments but panic when they can't respond to pandemics or natural disasters. We want liberty but also order. It's complicated. And in the future? Who knows? Will AI make governing smarter? Will digital platforms replace voting booths? Will corporations become governments? Or will we just go full caveman again and fight over Wi-Fi like it's mammoth meat? Whatever happens, remember, government is messy, flawed, and often frustrating. But without it, civilization becomes a group project with no teacher, no rules, and one guy hoarding all the resources in his bunker. And nobody wants to go back to that. So whether you're team big government, team tiny government, or just want to be left alone with your cat, remember, governance is messy and flawed, but it beats clubbing your neighbor over a rock. Now, if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, team big government or team tiny government, or maybe team benevolent cat dictatorship. I know which one I'm voting for.